retiring New York Times columnist Paul Krugman, yes, the same Paul Krugman who predicted markets would never recover after Donald Trump's 2016 victory, now says that President Biden will be well remembered for economic policies that Americans just voted against. Listen.
Here's the deeply unpopular opinion that will, I think, become orthodoxy a few decades from now, which is that Biden and his team actually managed the economy extremely well.
For a possibly more enlightened view of the economic follies of the past 4 years, we turn to Steve Moore, host of More Money on WABC Radio and co-author of the Trump Economic Miracle, and Judy Shelton, senior fellow at the Independent Institute and author of Good as Gold, How to Unleash the Power of Sound Money. Great to see you both. Judy, the real problem with all of this is that the orthodoxy from which Paul Krugman comes probably agrees with him. That is, the status quo of the economic community basically go along with what he said, or am I being a little too pessimistic?
Well, but it's delusional, and that doesn't mean he doesn't have adherents. But he has been wrong so often, really through decades. I've been opposed to Paul Krugman's government knows best approach since the 90s. He wrote a book in 1994 called Peddling Prosperity, which was to take a dig at supply-side economics, which had just delivered fantastic results under President Reagan. And I was asked by the Wall Street Journal to review that book, which I did with gusto, taking issue with just about every point he made. But what was especially sweet is they allowed me to suggest the title for my review of Peddling Prosperity. And I suggested Peddling Pomposity.
There you go.
Because that really encapsulates that whole attitude that he brings to his economic viewpoint.
Well, you see, you never let facts get in the way of your narrative. That's the Krugman way of looking at things. And fortunately, the American people do look at the facts, and they weighed the facts in the last election. But, Steve, it's the same short-sighted people who claim that the 2017 tax cuts put in place cost $2 trillion and are now saying it's going to cost $5 trillion just to re-up it, to extend it further. Robert Reich, the former labor secretary, wrote an ex-post, I think this was today. He said Trump's first round of tax cuts for the rich added $2 trillion to the debt. Extending them would add another $5 trillion if we can't afford universal health care or paid family leave or basic social safety nets. I mean, again, to Judy's point, they totally ignore the fact that we gained $1.5 trillion since 2017 in revenue, and that's a 48% increase in revenue. He's got it exactly wrong.
Yeah, they always do. And by the way, our friend Paul Krugman, who we were just talking about, is the same guy 25 years ago who said, don't worry, the internet is just a passing fad. It's going to go away. So, he's made all sorts of crazy predictions. But here's why this is important, though. Our side wins the intellectual arguments, thanks to smart people like Judy Shelton and Larry Kudlow and Art Laffer and you. But there's an old saying, the left writes the history books, and they do. And so they've written this fairy tale over and over and over again. And this is the start of the fairy tale. Oh, Joe Biden was a great president. He took over from a mess from Donald Trump, which wasn't true. The economy was in full recovery when Joe Biden came in. And they won't talk about the fact that the average incomes of average Americans fell when Joe Biden was president, whereas they rose by about $6,000 for the average family when Trump was president. And so that's why this is so important, is they control the narrative. And it's always been this kind of false narrative that's based on...
And the big question, I'm going to stick with you on this, Steve, because I know you've been working the town, but why do some Republicans inside the Beltway believe this stuff? I mean, it's just extraordinary that some Republicans have actually bought into the cost of tax cuts.
Yeah, you're right about that. And there are some problem makers in the Republican Party. By the way, there was related to this point, David, there was an excellent piece by Peggy Noonan in her weekend story about Ronald Reagan's last press conference before he left the presidency. And I took the time to watch that press conference, and Reagan said so concisely that, look, we cut taxes in the 1980s and tax revenues went up. He had to explain that over and over to a media that just couldn't get the message. And I thought, here we are 40 years later, they still don't get it.
Yeah. Well, it's not just a party in power that's blind to the facts, Judy. The Fed seems to be more and more so as well, the Federal Reserve Board. And we put up a chart. I wanted to redux the chart, put it up again, of what the Fed has been doing in lowering rates compared to what the market has been doing in raising rates. In other words, the market, the real traders in debt, particularly the 10-year yield, the 10-year Treasury bonds, they have been going up exactly at the same time the Fed has been going down. That's why our dollar's not as good as gold, to quote a famous book of yours.
Well, I think the market is giving a different message because you're getting such mixed messages from the Federal Reserve. At the last meeting, they cut rates, but at the same time, it was a very hawkish message. So I think that what might be happening is this practice the Fed has of paying commercial banks not to make loans. They pay 4.4% on cash reserve balances. That's a pretty good return for doing nothing. And I think that has very much distorted that yield curve. So when you get a hawkish message and you're now hearing there will just be 2 more cuts versus 4 more cuts next year, now that President Trump is in office, the Fed is suddenly worried. I think that banks probably thought, why not just let this keep rolling? We'll just collect that money for doing nothing. And so it reduces their demand for the longer term Treasury securities. At the same time, the Fed is actually allowing some rolling off of their longer Treasury security portfolio. So you're seeing decreased demand for those longer term instruments. So it's kind of a mechanical effect. But the lower demand does increase the yield for the long term.
Well, the bottom line, again, it comes back to what our representatives are doing and spending our money. I mean, bottom line, it comes back to spending our money. And even if they don't have enough money, they'll still spend it, Stephen. And that leads us to the Doge brothers and what the Doge brothers might be doing and how much they can actually do. Of course, cutting waste is one thing, the low-hanging fruit on the tree. The waste and fraud that you find here and there. And it does add up, and there are millions of examples of it. We're going to be talking to Senator Kramer about that in a moment. But here's what Vivek wrote. I think this was written yesterday. He said, another ex-post, he said, if you can't reform an agency, an entire agency, there's only one right answer left. And he doesn't even have to tell us what that is. It's get rid of it, right? Particularly when it's a department like the Department of Education, which has had exactly the opposite effect. The more money we spend on the Department of Education and the more they dole out, the worse the test scores of our children get. So it has exactly the opposite effect. We'd be better off without it, wouldn't we?
Well, look, that's why having businessmen like Elon Musk run this thing is so critical because, in the private sector, if something doesn't work, you get rid of it, right?
That's right.
David, in the public sector,
or you subsidize it even more. That's the problem. We haven't given them enough money. We need to give them more.
Yeah, Milton Friedman used to talk about that. If the program is working, we have to give them more money because it's working. If it's not working, they don't have enough money. We have to give. The answer is always more money. Look, I think this Doge committee is going to change the culture, hopefully, of how we spend money and how we assess this $7 trillion ungodly budget we have right now.
Yeah, good stuff, guys. Thank you so much. Steve Moore, Judy Shelton, wonderful material for us. Appreciate